When giving a presentation, how do you cut to the why? And what's the role of empathy? That's just some of what we'll be talking about on this episode of Talking Talks. Hello and welcome to Talking Talks, a behind-the-scenes look at how great presenters make great presentations. I'm your host, Bri Williams, and today we are joined by Dr. Sarah Glova. Sarah is a self-professed nerd who taught herself to code in high school. As a speaker, Sarah is known for making complicated or technical trends understandable for all skill levels. She has a PhD in instructional technology and is an experienced entrepreneur, published author, seasoned board member, and international public speaker. I can't wait to hear what Sarah has to share, so let's get started. Sarah, a very warm welcome, and I noticed on your LinkedIn profile you describe your superpower as being able to cut to the why. So in honor of our theme today, I thought let's start by cutting to the why and explaining why that is so important.
I love that. Thank you for bringing that up first. So cutting to the why, it is so great when you can immediately help your audience understand what's in it for them. And so something I'd even share right now is if you can do a better job hooking your audience in the very beginning. I don't mean hooking isn't tricking them or enticing them on something that's different. I just mean if you can get their attention, get them to say, oh, wait, this might be for me. They're going to listen to so much more of your content. They're going to be better listeners. You're going to be able to share more examples. You're going to be able to connect with them. Those first few minutes are so crucial for that. And so when I say cutting to the wire, when we talk about that in some of my presentation skills training, it's all about helping you connect your content to what your audience is going to be interested in.
I love that. So can you give us a sense of, do you have a go-to statement that you use or a technique that you entice people with?
I do like to try to help people save time. So if there's a topic that I can talk about in some way as by sharing this topic with you, I can help you save time. I'm going to go over a lot of the research with you so that you don't have to, or I'm going to share some of the mistakes I made so that you don't have to make them. You can benefit from my lessons learned without the pain of the sunburn. Anything that I can do to help them save time, I feel like that's usually a quick win with people. And then once I get to learn more about them, then I can tailor something that's more specific to their job, their industry, their values. It just depends on how big the audience is, because you really want to have something that's going to connect to everyone in the room.
And that is, I think, one of the arts of presentation, isn't it? And for me, the language I'm sort of playing around here with is empathy and having an empathy for your audience. So is that something that's come naturally to you? For instance, even switching a statement from a topic that you're thinking about to reframing it from their perspective, that's a conscious decision. So talk to me a little bit about empathy.
I love that. Empathy might be my actual superhero power. Maybe I should change my LinkedIn profile. So I remember once I took a personality inventory and it described me as similar to a Santa Claus in that I could quickly judge a situation and know if it was naughty or nice. It's just always been something that I'm pretty good at. So I can tell pretty quickly how people are reacting to something. I can put myself in their shoes. And so certainly for me, that empathy piece comes into it. But I love to share this about the skill of cutting to the why. It's something you can learn. So I tend to pull from empathy and trying to understand from my audience's perspective, what are they going to value as they're sitting in those seats? How are they going to feel when I tell them that I can save them time or help them not make the mistakes I did, just as examples. But say that's not a skill of yours and you have trouble reading people, I think there are other ways you can do it. Even if you're kind of a data head and you come at it from a data perspective, you can look at the audience in front of you and ask yourself some questions about the kinds of information that they might value. There are so many different approaches. So for me, certainly empathy comes into play, and that's definitely what I do, is try to pretend like I am the audience member, and that, if I'm them sitting there, what are they feeling? What are they thinking? But that's not to say that's the only way you can do it.
And there are a couple of points at which you are in that mindset. So when you're describing that, I'm thinking, okay, there's a few different junctures. Perhaps I'm taking the brief from a client, and so that's one experience, and then it's me carving out some time and starting to bring my thoughts together and thinking it through from what I imagine the audience. And then there's almost the live experience, and then having to recalibrate. Am I right in those being three of the junctures at which you're sort of working through the empathy prism?
I love that. I might take that, the empathy. That's absolutely it. You're such an expert. It's like you should have a show or something. I do it at a couple different stages. I love right in the beginning when I connect with a client or when I connect with an association about the opportunity to speak. I ask them, what's your audience like? What are they interested in? What have they heard too much about? What do they want to hear more about? What are they complaining about? What are they excited about? But then, to your point, there's that additional phase where you have to do some work on your own. And I talk about this a lot with the students that I work with. It's great to ask your manager who's going to be in the room when I give this presentation, but doing some work on your own and then going and talking to some of those people and asking, are you bringing anyone to the board presentation? Is anyone else coming to the training session? And then you can have the opportunity to say, before we start, are there any things you're hoping that I go over? Doing some of that tactical research on your own rather than relying on other people's perspectives. And if you don't know anyone who's going to connect you to those people directly, you can do some research. Who did past training sessions or meetings like that? And who was in the room when they did that? And can you talk with them? If it's a conference, can you look and see who attended last year and who was tweeting about it? And so a lot of what I just described there sounds like a ton of work, and people might hear that and think, oh, that's too. You can do that amount of research in a Netflix episode's worth of time. It's really just a little bit of internet reconnaissance sometimes, or a couple quick conversations with people. That small investment can make a huge difference in the final presentation.
I really like that, and certainly the switching out a Netflix episode, because oftentimes we wrap ourselves into a ball thinking we don't have time to do these sorts of things. So switching it out for a Netflix show is a great idea. I think you're the first person that has spoken to me about that. So really getting into the mindset of the audience, which I love. Let's now watch a clip, and I've labelled it setting the scene. So hopefully this is what you are doing. So let's have a look at Sarah on stage.
Ooh, okay.
But I am an entrepreneur, and that means that a lot of times I'm the one making decisions about things, and I'm planning the strategy, and there's no one to answer my questions. At the end of the day, I kind of have to answer them. I can bounce things off my team, and my team is wonderful, but I still have to answer those questions, and that can be isolating. So a few years ago, I started going to entrepreneur groups, women in business groups. I joined an organization that changed my life.
And I left it at that cliffhanger. So that people go and watch your video. But tell us about that. Was that you setting the scene in building this anticipation and cutting to the wire?
It was. I really enjoyed that talk. So it was an opportunity to share the history of women in entrepreneurship in my home state. And we went all the way back to some women who started businesses even when banks could require them to have their husbands co-sign on loans. And it's pretty recent. I mean, these are women who started businesses in the 70s. And I think a lot of that history is lost, and I wanted to connect it to what mattered to people in the room. It's kind of hard to imagine people attending an event like that and me starting with so back in 1970, they're going to feel like they're back in history class. And so I tried to set the stage there with a description of the feeling of isolation, because even if you've never been an entrepreneur, I think that's something that anyone can relate to. And so I was trying to help the audience understand that when I sought out the organization, the National Association of Women Business Owners, that's how I was feeling, and that community helped me feel connected to then a legacy of women business owners. And that's how I started talking about the history. So in that example, it was that feeling of isolation. And it's neat, at the end of that talk, I won't give anything away, but at the end of that talk, I find an old newspaper clipping that has a crazy connection between me and one of the first women business owners who had a corporate office in what's called the Research Triangle Park, which is a big kind of corporate area in our state. And I kind of reveal that to the audience as a connection. I won't tell you what the whole thing is, but it just, that thread of isolation and then community, I hope helped everyone in that room to feel more connected to the stories of those women business owners that we were trying to share there.
So Sarah, in that presentation, you had the beautiful clip at the end, which we're not revealing, but it was a newspaper clip. Did you use your background in instructional technology and instructional design to then architect how you were going to get there? Was that your starting position that you then had to retrofit, or how did you go about it?
That's such a good question. I do think that I use my background in instructional design and instructional technology to help me create my talks. And all that means, in case anyone doesn't want to go get additional degrees, here's what I learned. All that means is I spend a lot of time thinking about the learning objectives and how those learning objectives can build. So, starting to make sure there's that foundational knowledge, starting with kind of the basics and then building from there. But then also making sure that you're using technology that's appropriate to the audience in front of you. When I say instructional technology, sometimes I think people hear, oh, she wants to use VR and everything. She wants to use chatbots and everything. And it doesn't mean that I want to put technology in everything. It just means that I can diagnose what would be best for a certain context. So sometimes that does mean virtual reality. Sometimes it means a scan of an old newspaper clipping that you found. I mean, it just depends. And so for me, using that background in, what are the learning objectives? What do I want the audience to take away from this, to learn? What do I want them to be able to do? Do I want them to be able to describe the business structures that the women had when they were starting businesses in the 1970s? Or do I want them to relate to their stories? Do I want them to learn about the policies? I really write that out. And then, I think about what materials I have, whether it's old scans, old photos when I'm doing a presentation that's more about the history, or a lot of times I talk about smart city topics. And for that, it's not necessarily scans of what was going on in the 1970s, right? There's going to be different materials that I pull in. And so I do think I use that background, but I think for me, at the end of the day, it's all about the story. I love storytelling. I want to make sure that no matter what I'm talking about, whether it's something with as much emotion and connection to me as the thread of women in entrepreneurship creating a community for 40 years, or something that feels more technical and cold, like how the data revolution is transforming city government. Both of those things can leverage storytelling to help an audience see themselves in that topic. And so at the end of the day, even with applying those principles, thinking through the learning objectives, I try to get back to what's the story.
I was very curious about that because a lot of the topics that you cover, they seem quite disparate. So we've got women in technology and, new technology. So I suppose there is certainly a key connection there. Talking about vacation days, I saw you talking about as well. What else? You seem to cover quite a few different topics. What's the through line for you?
That's great. I'm pretty much a marketing person's worst nightmare, right? Because they always say like go niche or go home is the big saying that I've heard recently. And I don't do that. I talk about so many things. I love to talk about technology. And a lot of times that is a smart city topic or technology and education. I love to talk about business and entrepreneurship and themes there. Sometimes I dive into the diversity, equity, and inclusion side of that. And a lot of times that's women in business and women in entrepreneurship. And then I really love communication training and presentation skills. So I saw one of your other speakers, one of your other guests, I think it was Rachel Service, who said that she'd never met a microphone she didn't like. Is that right? So I related to that very much. I really do like to talk. And if you called me and you were like, we really want to do a presentation on frogs, like we care a lot about frogs, I'd be like, do you? Okay, I could do that. I'm not entirely sure I know anything about frogs. But if you gave me enough time, I could find a reason to make the audience care about frogs. And I think that's the thread for me. It's not that I have a disingenuous desire to speak, and so I'll speak about anything. It's more that I truly believe that there is a story, there is a human connectedness to everything. And a lot of times for me, that's the connection. It's that piece of community. I feel like in the smart city and tech space, a lot of times that's missing. People want to know, how does this affect me? Even if it's the latest and greatest complicated tech trend, they want to know how it affects them. And so finding the thread there, if it's presentation skills or communication skills, a lot of that has a connection to helping, especially the younger adults, to get employed or helping people to get promotions and be successful. I mean, there's a huge community and camaraderie connection there. And then, gosh, women in business and entrepreneurship, that one's kind of obvious. So whether it's frogs or smart city stuff, my task really is to research the topic until the story becomes apparent. And if that means that someone sees this and challenges me to give a topic about frogs, like I'm writing one now in the back of my head. I'm ready.
I cannot wait. I think I can't wait to see you interviewing Kermit or doing something like that. But
look, taking notes.
That is so interesting because, yes, it is a marketing challenge when you are trying to package yourself and brand yourself, and you run a marketing company, right? So
I do a little bit, yes. So we're a digital media firm, and so we do create a lot of materials to help organizations market and promote. But at the end of the day, we're more focused on e-learning and online training. It's just there's a lot of consumer education need right now. There are so many companies that are coming out with products that the audience doesn't even know what it is, much less how they use it or why they need it. And so a lot of our clients do come to us for more of a marketing need. My background isn't in traditional marketing, so I always try to be careful to make that difference because I don't want any marketing experts to think that I'm stepping on their toes. But certainly, I think the e-learning and online training, the instructional design principles can lend a huge hand to those companies that are trying to overcome that challenge of teaching consumers about what the heck they make and helping them care about it.
and it does all circle back to you and the why, because I can just feel your enthusiasm and your passion for this transfer of knowledge. And I think it's so exciting. And you're conveying it through this sort of digital media, let alone being on stage. But speaking of your virtual presentations, let's have a sneaky peek at some that I saw online recently. So I've got a couple of clips of you. Let's take a look.
Okay.
Yes, and that's why today, together, we're going to do an exercise that will ask you to think about a time you showed resilience. We're going to talk about what that looked like for you and which of your strengths you called on when you had to show resilience. Let's go over the instructions quickly, then we'll give you time to do the exercise. You can write notes down on a scrap of paper or put text into a note on your phone, or if you'd prefer, you can just do a focused daydream. I'm not going to ask you to share your reflection with the group. This is for you.
There you go. Sorry, the audio was a little bit wonky from my end. But yeah, I just wanted to share those from a couple of different perspectives. One is that you were co-facilitating. So I'd love you to talk about that. And also how you set up instructions and perhaps why it's different virtually to what you might do in real life. So let's talk firstly about co-facilitating in a virtual space.
Yes. So in that talk, I was co-facilitating with one of my favorite people. Her name's Dr. Sarah Warren. We're both Sarahs. And so that, makes things confusing, but otherwise it's amazing working with her. We were co-facilitating at a virtual summit, the Women Transforming Technology, WT2, and we practiced that presentation. I've been presenting with Dr. Egan Warren for almost 10 years now, and we practiced that presentation, I want to say 8 times at least. And I don't mean, from original show notes on. I mean, we really practiced that presentation so many times. And it's because in that virtual space, we wanted to just cut down any fluff, keep it engaging, keep it fun, but it's so hard to keep people's attention in the virtual space. And we knew that if we were going to engage the audience in that topic, we were going to have to keep things moving. We also were really careful not to do too much. I've worked on huge workshops with Dr. Egan Warren where we have led, faculty groups through hours and hours of day-long workshops and training. this was a short virtual presentation. And so we cut to the bare bones of that exercise to make sure that our audience was going to walk away with something that was helpful to them. And so for anyone who's thinking about co-facilitating, I would just say that there is so much more that you need to practice. And especially for us, it was all about the transitions. We didn't want it to feel jarring for the audience to be hearing almost like ping pong back and forth, back and forth. And so we made sure that those section breaks were actually helpful, that we would have a transition from one person to another when there was a natural pause, or when it was actually helpful for the audience to maybe have a mental shift from one topic to another.
And in terms of the instructions, of course, what really struck me about the instructions, so in that second clip we were watching, is that you were really telegraphing or signposting what was expected of people and walking them through things. Can you explain to me and the audience why you approached it in that way?
Absolutely. And even just whoever, has a chance to hear that presentation, one of the things that I have found really helpful and I'd love to share is, you might have heard me say, this isn't something you're going to share with the group. This is just for you.
I'm not going to ask you to share your reflection with the group. This is for you.
And I think that's really big when you're asking the audience to reflect on something that's even a little bit personal. I mean, in this presentation, we were talking about resilience. When you're asking the audience to reflect on that, let them know if it's something that they're going to have to share with the person sitting next to them or with the group. And let them know right away, we're going to ask you to type this into the chat. We're going to ask you to keep this to yourself, whatever it is. And I think that really helps with participation. And then, yes, letting the audience know exactly what you're expecting of them. Now, with my background in instructional design, I like to think a lot about the different kinds of learners there are. We don't all learn the same way. Some of us like to take messy notes on Post-its, even if they're supposed to be in tech, they write things on colored Post-its. Some people can't stand that and want to do things on their phone. Some people don't like to have anything tactile and they just want to think it through. And so when you say letting the audience know what you expect, I don't necessarily mean tell them how to write down stuff. Like, they know how to write down stuff. They know their preference for how they want to write down stuff, or whether they just want to think it through. What you're more letting them know is, what do you expect them to do with this information? What I was trying to communicate there is, please interact with this. Think about it, reflect on it. You might want to take some notes. You might want to think about it, whatever is best for you. You're not going to share it, but we're going to be using what you think about here in the next part of the exercise. So spend some time on that. So it's more about the sharing the why of why they're doing what they're doing than the specific, like, please go get a pen and a piece of paper.
I think what struck me about it, and maybe it's the theme of today underneath the theme, or perhaps it's just my projection, but it's empathy again coming through, in that placing yourself in the position of the audience and understanding that they will hold varying degrees of anxiety or tension about any sort of task that we're requiring of them. And it's quite an interesting thing, isn't it? We want them to be engaged, but all of us as audience members, as soon as a presenter says, we're going to do an exercise, everyone's rolling their eyes.
I love presenters and I love presenting, and I'm in a room and someone's like, all right, can you guys switch seats? We're going to do group work. I'm like, ugh, it's terrible. I mean, I have to force myself in those moments to not make that noise. And what's great is it's a little bit like going to the gym. We're all like, we don't want to do it. But then once we're there, or once we're done exercise, we're usually glad we did it. And so it's helpful in both ways. One, for me to remember that when I'm in the audience, to not be a brat. And then two, when I'm on stage and I feel some of that reaction, to stay positive, not to overcoach. Come on, y'all, we're going to love this. I promise. Like, that doesn't help. Nobody wants that either. But just to be patient and let that tension be there for a little bit and kind of walk people through, why you're doing it, so that they, even if it's begrudgingly, at least start on the task that you're setting for them.
And another interesting thing you did in that presentation was to have quite large slabs perceptually of silence, because you're actually giving them thinking time, that you're actually requiring them to reflect. And so you and your Sarah, just were quiet. And when there's silence in an online presentation, what else is there to do but the task?
Yeah. I think that's an underutilized tool. It really shocks people when you say, we're going to be quiet for 45 seconds and let you work on this. We'll be back in 45 seconds. And then you shut up. People are like, what? And it takes them a few seconds to kind of get into it and then start to do the task. They listen like, well, are they going to play music? They're not even going to play music. Okay, I guess I got to do the task. And we found that shock to be really helpful and a great tool for us as we're trying to do virtual presentations that feel a little bit different. Also, we just need some space, don't we? All of us need a few seconds. Like, give me a second to collect my thoughts. It's so hard in the virtual space because we want an interaction and sometimes it's not there. And so in that case, we actually couldn't see the audience at all. And we didn't even really have access to the chat. We had a moderator who was handling that for us. And so we weren't seeing reactions. And that's so hard for a lot of presenters. I know it's hard for me. I love audience interaction. But we just had to trust that what was going to be best for our audience was if we gave them that space and trusted that they were going to do the exercise. And it worked really well. And I think people got to have those few seconds. I guess that does feed into some advice for virtual presenters, because you have to connect with the moderators too. Like a moderator will be like, oh, it's a little silent. Do you need me to jump in here? And so I sometimes warn moderators when I'm doing a Q&A virtually, I let them know I'm really comfortable with silence. So if I ask a question and nobody answers right away, don't jump in with your own question. Like, let's just really let people sit with it for a second. And you can kind of see, especially if there's other cameras, people do that thing of like, is no one going to talk? We should talk. Like, they're so uncomfortable. But then what's really beautiful is I think a lot of times you get a question from somebody who maybe wouldn't have asked it otherwise because they were given a few seconds to just think.
A final question around that virtual presentation. I was struck also by your choice of slides being the dominant and you and Sarah just being little talking heads in the corner. Was that a deliberate tactic that you were using?
Yeah, that's a great question. We were kind of like in the corner. For that one, that was the preference of the conference. And I think it was a great exercise for us. We focused more on those slides than we usually do. I try not to rely too heavy on my slides. I try to make sure that they're helpful and hopefully engaging, well designed. But I really like to try to be the presence. And so it was so funny to kind of be sequestered to the corner, if you will. But for us, we knew that we'd asked questions about what it was going to look like. We'd done those test runs. And so since we knew that, we tried to make sure that our slides reflected the kind of presenters that we are, which I kind of already mentioned. We tried to really cut to the chase in that one, really make sure we were just focusing on the core principles and giving people space. And so a lot of those slides, they had breath. They could breathe. There was white space. There wasn't too much going on. There weren't a lot of clip arty pictures. When we were talking about the slides, we wanted them to have almost like a spa feel. That was like the color palette we chose because we wanted it to feel like a calming break for people. And so a lot about those slides, that was intentional. I think it depends on the audience and the conference organizers and all that. I really love what you do with your show, which is you kind of toggle back and forth so that it's both us speaking to each other and having this conversation, but then there being these breaks of video clips and other things. If I had to pick a favorite virtual strategy, it would probably be that. I love having those kinds of breaks and those things pop in. I think it's interesting. And I think the other thing it's really helped me with, honestly, is just grace and kindness with other presenters. I think like a lot of speakers, I like to attend events and see what other speakers are doing. And if I see something crazy, the cat jumps on the keyboard, the tech is glitching, whatever it is, you just grace and kindness. I think that because we've all had to adapt and we've had to do so much virtually, I think the audience is actually okay with lower production value or small mistakes. It's a little bit humanizing and sometimes it's very authentic. And so if there is something unexpected in that virtual format, maybe you didn't know that you were going to be a small talking head and then there you are. That's not what happened with us, but just say, I think there's ways to kind of roll with that. Was it Ann Miles who said, she advertises herself like, if you want a polished speaker, that's not me. I love that. I think a lot of speakers are really embracing the authenticity and speaking is a thing that humans do. And so as long as humans are doing it, there are going to be mistakes. And so I think with this virtual environment, we just have to be okay with that and willing to take a deep breath and to keep on going.
Sarah, this has been fabulous. It will forever in my memory be known as the Frog Talk, of course.
The Frog Talk.
But yeah, the through line for me, it's getting to the why, having a strong sense of empathy for your audience, but also within the parameters of understanding what the learning objective is and really starting from there. Sarah, thank you so much. That's all we have time for on this episode of Talking Talks. Now, if you want to find out more about Sarah, and why wouldn't you, you can find Sarah at her website, sarahglova.com. And as always, you can find more about me at briwilliams.com. Always, please consider subscribing to Talking Talks so you always get the next episode. Sarah, thank you again. It's been fabulous talking to you. Long live the frog.